Ziller opened his eyes, gasping for air. His entire body felt like it was on fire. A sharp pain shot through his veins, and his skin burned as if it was melting from the inside. He tried to move, but his muscles ached, and his hands trembled. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He forced himself to sit up, his breathing heavy and ragged. The dim, cold light of the cell flickered above him. Metal walls surrounded him, trapping him like an animal. The last thing he remembered was being dragged into a human laboratory, their cold, emotionless eyes studying him like an experiment. Now he was here, alone, burning alive. Ziller gritted his teeth. His reptilian scales, once smooth and strong, now cracked, revealing something strange underneath. He looked at his arm, his sharp claws shaking as he lifted it to his face. His skin, it wasn't just melting. It was changing. Beneath the cracked scales, a faint glow pulsed, red, orange, almost like molten metal. His heart pounded. What had the humans done to him? Suddenly, a wave of pain surged through his body. Ziller roared in agony, slamming his fists against the metal floor. His vision blurred, his head spinning. His veins felt like they were filled with liquid fire, spreading through his body like an unstoppable force. He dug his claws into the ground, trying to steady himself, but the heat inside him kept rising. Through the pain, a terrifying thought struck him. Am I dying? A sharp mechanical hiss broke through the silence. Ziller's eyes darted to the cell door. It slid open with a low, cold sound. Two humans in white lab coats stepped inside, their faces unreadable. One of them, an older man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, stepped closer. Ziller growled, trying to move, but his body refused to obey. The fire inside him made him weak. The old man tilted his head, observing him like a scientist watching a caged beast. Fascinating, he murmured. He's still conscious. Ziller bared his fangs. What did you do to me? His voice was hoarse, filled with pain. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. We didn't do anything, Ziller. We simply unlocked what was already inside you. Ziller's eyes widened. Unlocked. What was that supposed to mean? The second scientist, a younger woman with sharp eyes, tapped on a small device. A holographic screen appeared in front of her, displaying strange symbols and energy readings. His body temperature is rising, she said. Stabilization is failing. If this continues, he won't die. The older man interrupted. He will evolve. Ziller let out a ragged breath. Evolve. This wasn't evolution. This was torture. His body trembled as another surge of heat exploded from within. The metal walls around him shook. The floor beneath him cracked. The humans took a step back, their expressions unreadable. Ziller could feel it now. Something growing inside him. Something dangerous. His arms pulsed with a strange, fiery energy. His claws, once natural weapons, were now glowing. The air around him grew hotter. The older scientist studied him with fascination. Incredible, he whispered. The power is spreading. Ziller clenched his fists. He wasn't sure what was happening, but one thing was clear. He was no longer the same. And whatever the humans had done to him, they would regret it. Ziller's breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling as if each breath might be his last. His body still burned, the fire inside him growing stronger. He tried to fight it, tried to hold on to himself, but the heat was unbearable. His vision flickered, his surroundings shifting in and out of focus. The walls of his prison seemed to bend and warp in the heat radiating from his body. The two human scientists remained still, watching him like a predator watches its prey. The older man's lips curled into a satisfied smirk, while the younger woman's eyes darted between Ziller and a holographic screen floating in front of her. The readings are unstable, she muttered. His energy levels are spiking beyond our projections. Let them, the older man replied. This is exactly what we expected. Ziller gritted his teeth, his claws scraping against the metal floor. He wanted to tear them apart. He wanted to make them suffer for what they had done to him. But his body refused to obey him. It was changing, shifting into something he didn't understand. "You're in pain," the old scientist said, stepping closer. "That's good. Pain means you're transforming." Ziller's glowing eyes locked onto him. "Transforming? Into what?" "You were born strong," the man continued, as if explaining to a child. "But not strong enough. Your kind, your species, has always been powerful, but limited. We removed those limits." Ziller's claws curled into fists. His mind swam with confusion and fury. The heat inside him wasn't just painful anymore. It was alive. It surged through his veins like fire and lightning combined, pushing against his skin, demanding to be released. The young scientist frowned as new numbers flashed across her screen. "Sir, if he can't regulate this power..." The old man raised a hand, silencing her. "He will." His eyes gleamed with something dangerous. "Or he will burn." The words sent a chill through Ziller's mind, cutting through the fire for a moment. Burn. Did they truly not care if their experiment destroyed itself? Another wave of pain struck him, stronger than before. Ziller gasped, falling to one knee as the burning sensation intensified. His vision blurred. The metal floor beneath him hissed as his skin melted through it, leaving glowing red imprints where his hands touched. Panic surged through him. His body was breaking apart, or was it rebuilding itself? His arms shimmered with strange new patterns, his once solid flesh pulsing like living energy. He could hear something now, a faint hum, a vibration deep within his bones. It wasn't a sound he had ever heard before. It was coming from inside him. The old scientist watched with fascination. "The fusion is nearly complete." Ziller's head snapped up. "What have you done?" His voice was deeper, more distorted. He hardly recognized it as his own. The younger scientist hesitated, looking uncertain for the first time. She glanced at her superior. "Sir, if this continues..." "It must continue," the old man said sharply. "He has no choice." Ziller's claws dug into the floor, sending sparks flying. His entire body trembled with an unfamiliar force. He wasn't just changing. He was becoming something else. A flash of memory hit him. His capture, the cold steel tables, the needles piercing his skin. The humans had injected something into him, something unnatural. He had fought against it, but now it was winning. The younger scientist's screen flashed red. Her eyes widened. "Sir, his heat levels are reaching critical." Too late. A deep boom echoed through the room. The floor beneath Ziller buckled. The walls shook. The very air warped around him. Ziller roared as a massive shockwave of energy exploded from his body. The two scientists were flung backward, crashing against the metal walls. The old man gasped, but his face wasn't filled with fear. It was filled with excitement. Ziller stumbled forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The fire inside him had not faded. It had grown. His once reptilian skin now pulsed with fiery veins, glowing like molten rock. He raised a hand and watched in horror as flames danced across his claws, flickering like a living entity. This wasn't strength. This wasn't power. This was a curse. He turned toward the humans, his glowing eyes narrowing. He could crush them both. He could burn them into nothing. The fire inside him wanted to. But something stopped him, a whisper in the back of his mind. They had done this to him. But why? He needed answers. Ziller took a step forward. The metal floor melted under his feet. The scientists scrambled to their feet, but neither ran. "You still don't understand, do you?" The old man whispered, his voice filled with something close to awe. "You think we tortured you?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "But Ziller, we set you free." Ziller's breathing slowed. His mind was a storm of rage and confusion. This wasn't just an experiment. This was a weapon, and the humans had turned him into it. Ziller's body pulsed with unbearable heat, his veins surging with energy beyond his control. The room around him was no longer the sterile metallic prison it had been moments ago. Now, the floor beneath him was warped and melted, the walls scorched from the sheer force of his transformation. Smoke curled into the air, the scent of burning metal mixing with the sterile scent of the lab. The two scientists stood before him, their white coats singed at the edges. But they weren't afraid. The older one, the man with silver hair and cold blue eyes, studied Zylar with something far worse than fear, satisfaction. The younger woman beside him, however, had taken a step back, clutching her tablet, her face twisted in uncertainty. Ziller's claws curled into fists, flames flickering around them. His breathing was uneven, his mind caught between rage and confusion. His body was no longer his own. It felt like something else had taken residence inside him. Something vast, uncontrollable. "What have you done to me?" Zyler growled, his voice deeper now, almost layered, like two voices speaking at once. It sent vibrations through the air. The very walls seemed to tremble at the sound. The old scientist tilted his head. "We've done what nature never could," he said calmly. "We've taken something strong and made it perfect." Ziller's eyes burned with fury. "Perfect. I feel like I'm being ripped apart." His body pulsed again, another wave of unbearable heat radiating from him. The room's temperature spiked, causing sweat to bead on the scientists' faces, but they still refused to back away. "You're resisting the change," the scientist continued, as if explaining a theory rather than talking to a living, suffering being. "That's why it hurts. Your body is adjusting to a new state of existence." Zillar could barely listen. His limbs trembled, the heat inside him growing stronger. He could feel something shifting under his skin, something alien. His scales, once solid, were now cracked with glowing fissures, the molten fire beneath threatening to burst free. He took a staggering step forward. The metal groaned under his weight, melting into liquid beneath his feet. The young scientist gasped, glancing at her device. "Sir, he's destabilizing." He won't break," the old man interrupted. His cold blue eyes met Zyler's burning gaze. "He'll ascend." Ziller snarled, lunging forward, his claws raised, but before he could strike, a shockwave burst from his body, sending him crashing to the floor. He gasped, his entire form convulsing. His vision blurred. His chest tightened as the fire inside him fought to be released. The heat was too much. His skin split apart. A roar of agony tore from his throat as his body erupted in flames. He expected pain, but instead, something changed. The fire wasn't destroying him. It was remaking him. His muscles stretched, his form shifting. His fingers elongated, his claws turning sharper, glowing with an unnatural light. His once reptilian features became something more primal, more powerful. The very essence of his being burned away, replaced by something new. When the fire finally died down, Zyler was different. The scientist stared in awe. The young woman's mouth hung open slightly. The old man's smirk widened. "Beautiful," he whispered. Ziller slowly rose to his feet, his breath steady now. The pain was gone. He looked at his hands. The cracks in his skin still glowed, but the fire no longer burned him. It obeyed him. He clenched his fist, watching as the flames coiled around his fingers, flickering at his command. He turned his gaze back to the humans. "Why?" His voice was deeper, stronger. The old man stepped forward, his eyes gleaming. "Because your kind was never meant to stop evolving. We simply gave you a push." Ziller's mind raced. He had been transformed. But for what purpose? He took another step forward, and the young scientist tensed. She was afraid now. She could see it, what he had become. The old man, however, welcomed it. "What am I?" Zyler asked, his voice quieter now. The scientist's smile grew. "You," he said, "are the future. Ziller stood in the wreckage of his former self, his breath steady, his body no longer screaming in agony. The transformation was complete, but the battle inside him had only just begun. The flames that once threatened to consume him now coiled around his body like living serpents, obedient, waiting. He flexed his fingers, watching as the molten veins under his skin pulsed with fiery light. He could feel every inch of his newfound power, humming beneath his flesh, an untamed force waiting to be unleashed. Across the room, the older scientist watched him with pure satisfaction, as if admiring a masterpiece he had just completed. The younger scientist, however, had taken several steps back, her fingers tightening around the edge of her tablet. The look in her eyes was different now. Fear, uncertainty, maybe even regret. Ziller took a step forward. The metal floor hissed under his feet, his heat warping the air around him. The scientist didn't move. "You still don't understand, do you?" The older man mused, tilting his head. "You fight against this, but this power, it was always meant to be yours." Ziller's eyes burned with fury. "I never asked for this." The scientist smirked. "No, but you needed it." A snarl built in Ziller's throat. He wanted to tear this man apart, to erase him from existence. The flames around his hands flared, reacting to his rage. But then he saw it, the way the young scientist's hand hovered over her tablet, her thumb trembling over a command. Ziller's instincts screamed a warning. Before he could react, she pressed it. A high-pitched alarm shattered the silence. Instantly, Ziller's entire body seized. A searing pain erupted in his skull, his vision flashing red. His limbs locked up, his breath caught in his throat. The scientist's smirk deepened. "Ah," he mused. "There it is." Ziller fell to one knee, his claws scraping against the molten floor. Something was inside him. Some kind of control, a failsafe. It was like invisible chains wrapping around his mind, forcing him down, commanding obedience. The young scientist swallowed hard. "His neural inhibitors are still working," she reported, her voice unsteady. Neural inhibitors. They had built a cage inside his mind. Ziller roared, fighting against it. The fire inside him flared wildly, his body trembling as he tried to break free. But the pain intensified, white-hot and merciless. The older scientist crouched in front of him, lowering his voice to a whisper. "You may be powerful," he said, "but you are still ours." Ziller's claws scraped against the floor as his rage burned hotter than ever. His body might have been restrained, but his mind was still his. And he was learning. The flames licking at his skin flickered, pulsing to a strange rhythm. A heartbeat, a code. The scientist turned away, speaking to the younger woman. "Initiate phase 2. Increase his pain tolerance. We need him fully conditioned." They think they've won. Ziller focused. He could feel the inhibitors tightening, trying to drown out his thoughts, trying to force him into submission. But there was something they didn't anticipate. The fire inside him wasn't just a weapon. It was alive. A deep, rumbling growl formed in his chest as he did something he had never done before. He let go. The flames exploded from his body. The shockwave sent the scientists flying backward. The entire room trembled. The control panel sparked and shattered. The red emergency lights flickered and died. Ziller rose to his feet. The inhibitors burned away. The pain gone. The old scientist coughed, pushing himself up on shaking arms, his eyes wide in disbelief. "That's impossible." Ziller tilted his head, flames coiling around his body, his eyes now glowing like molten suns. "You wanted to create a god, didn't you?" Ziller murmured, his voice calm, deadly. He took a step forward. The metal curled and melted beneath his feet. The scientist scrambled backward. Ziller smiled, baring his fangs. "Then pray to him." The air in the lab was thick with smoke and heat. The walls cracked. The floor warped from Ziller's power. Sparks rained down from the flickering ceiling lights, barely illuminating the wreckage. The once sterile laboratory now looked like a battlefield, a place where science had played God and lost. Ziller stood in the center of it all, unchained, unleashed. His molten eyes burned with something far greater than rage. Clarity. Purpose. Across from him, the old scientist was on his knees, his pristine lab coat torn, his face streaked with soot and sweat. He had spent years creating the perfect weapon, but now that weapon stood before him, no longer under his control. Ziller took a slow step forward. The ground sizzled beneath his feet. "You thought you could keep me in chains," Ziller rumbled, his voice deeper now, layered with raw power. He flexed his fingers, flames licking at his claws. "You thought pain would make me your puppet." The scientist flinched but tried to mask it with a weak smirk. "Pain makes you stronger," he rasped, wiping his mouth. "You can deny it all you want, but we built you into something greater." Ziller tilted his head. Greater. The word was almost a whisper, but the fire in his tone made the scientist shrink back. Ziller clenched his fist. The air around him rippled with heat. "You think turning me into this was a gift? That burning away my past, my body, my very soul, was some favor?" He took another step, and the scientist crawled backward, his confidence crumbling. Ziller's molten eyes narrowed. "You didn't give me strength. You only forced me to find it." From the corner of the room, the young scientist watched, frozen in place. Her hand still clutched the broken tablet, her knuckles white. Ziller's gaze snapped to her. She gasped. "Did you know?" he asked. "Did you help him do this to me?" Her breath caught. I had no choice," she stammered. "They." Ziller lifted a clawed finger. "Don't lie." She swallowed hard, her heartbeat thudding in her chest. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the regret, the doubt that had been there since the beginning. She wasn't like the old scientist. She was scared of what they had done. But fear didn't erase the past. Ziller exhaled sharply. The flames around him flickered, but he turned his attention back to the real enemy. The scientist still on the ground. The man who had done this to him. "You took everything from me," Ziller growled. "My body, my future, my freedom." The scientist's smirk returned, a twisted, desperate thing. "We took what was weak," he said, forcing himself to his feet, "and made it invincible." Ziller's lips curled. "Is that what you think?" The scientist dusted off his coat, straightening his posture. Even now, he was arrogant. Even now, he thought he was still in control. Ziller sighed. "Then let me show you how wrong you are." Without warning, he raised his hand, and the fire surged. A wall of flames erupted from the ground, racing toward the scientist like a living creature, its heat warping the air, its hunger undeniable. The scientist's eyes widened. He stumbled back, but there was nowhere to run. For the first time, he was the one who felt powerless. And Ziller watched, unblinking, as the fire he had once feared became his justice. The young scientist screamed. She lunged forward, slamming her hands on a control panel, her fingers flying across the keys. A pulse of blue energy erupted from the walls, colliding with Ziller's flames, extinguishing them in an instant. Ziller whipped around. She was breathing hard, her eyes wide with panic. "You don't have to do this," she gasped. "You're free now. Don't become what they wanted you to be." Ziller stared at her. For a long moment, the only sound was the low crackle of dying embers. Then, slowly, he spoke. "They wanted me to be a monster." His voice was quiet, steady, unshaken. He took a step back, letting the flames around his body settle. But a monster wouldn't leave survivors. The scientist collapsed, panting, eyes wild with disbelief. Ziller looked at the young woman one last time. "You helped them, but you also stopped me." His molten gaze softened, just slightly. "Don't waste that chance." And then, with one final breath, he turned. The metal doors leading out of the lab melted away at his command, revealing the long, dark corridor beyond. His path to freedom. Without another word, he stepped through the flames and disappeared into the unknown. The cold air beyond the lab hit Zuller's skin like a shockwave, a stark contrast to the fire burning within him. He stepped into the vast corridor, his molten veins pulsing under his skin, his claws still radiating heat. The walls stretched endlessly, dark and lifeless, lined with reinforced steel. Somewhere in the distance, a faint alarm echoed through the facility, but Ziller was already far beyond their control. He had been created here, broken here, but he would not die here. Behind him, the scientist he had spared lay gasping, his body trembling from the heat that had nearly consumed him. The young woman still clutched the control panel, her hands shaking. But Ziller didn't look back. His feet burned prints into the metallic floor as he moved forward. His senses sharpened, scanning the facility for threats. They would come for him. They always did. But this time, he wasn't a test subject. This time, he was something else entirely. A low hum vibrated through the walls. Ziller's molten eyes narrowed. The energy in the air had changed, the atmosphere thick with something unnatural. It wasn't just the alarms or the lockdown. They were expecting him. Then, suddenly, movement. A metallic hiss broke the silence. The vents above him snapped open. In an instant, automated sentries dropped from the ceiling, their sleek black armor gleaming under the dim emergency lights. Their glowing red eyes locked onto him, scanning, calculating. Target acquired. A cold robotic voice echoed. Ziller exhaled slowly. He didn't stop walking. The first sentry lunged, blades extending from its wrists, a blur of metal and death. Ziller didn't even flinch. The fire answered before he did. With a flick of his wrist, a wave of white-hot flames erupted from his palm, swallowing the machine in an instant. The sentry's metal plating melted midair, its circuits frying with a burst of sparks. The others didn't hesitate. They moved as one, a relentless swarm, weapons primed, energy pulses charging in their chests. Ziller let them fire. Blazing blue energy ripped through the air, aiming straight for his core. But the moment the blasts hit, they vanished. The flames around Ziller's body devoured the attacks, absorbing them like fuel. His molten eyes burned brighter. The machines hesitated, analyzing, recalculating. They had been built to kill a test subject. They had never been designed to kill a god. Ziller moved. In a blur of speed, he tore through them like they were paper, his claws slicing through reinforced metal like it was nothing. His flames ignited their circuits, turning them into nothing but glowing slag. One by one, they fell. In seconds, it was over. Ziller stood amidst the wreckage, smoke rising from the charred remains of his enemies. His breathing was steady, his fire pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He looked down at his hands, the flickering embers dancing across his fingertips. He had once feared this power, this thing they had made him into. But now it was his. A sound made him pause. Footsteps. Soft, hesitant, not a machine. He turned slowly. The young scientist stood at the end of the corridor, her hands up, not in surrender, but in caution. She had followed him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she took a shaky breath. "They won't stop," she said. "They'll send more." Ziller's molten eyes studied her. "I know." She hesitated. Then, "What's your plan?" His flames flickered. For the first time, he let himself think beyond survival, beyond revenge, beyond escape. Ziller looked past her, toward the vast metal doors at the end of the corridor, the final barrier between him and the outside world. He had been trapped, tortured, and used. But somewhere beyond these walls, there was more than just a lab, more than just experiments, a world that had forgotten him, a world that had no idea what was coming. He stepped forward, his voice calm, but unyielding. "I'm going to burn it all down." The final doors stood before him, a towering wall of reinforced titanium, humming with energy fields designed to keep something like him inside. The lab had spared no expense in ensuring nothing escaped. But Ziller wasn't nothing. He was fire. He was fury. And he was done being their prisoner. The young scientist stood behind him, unsure, afraid. He could feel her hesitation like a pulse in the air. She should be running. Yet, she stayed. Ziller didn't look back. His molten gaze was locked on the obstacle ahead. He raised his hand, fingers curling into a fist, and the air around him ignited. Heat surged forward in an unstoppable wave, a force greater than anything the lab had accounted for. The energy fields crackled and warped, struggling against the sheer intensity of his power. Then, they failed.